Day my daughter called to invite me to her gallery opening, I was sitting in my corner office on the 14th floor of a building I partly owned. I remember thinking how strange life is, that the same woman who once told people her mother was dead was now calling to ask me to come watch her shine. My name is Lorraine. No, wait. Let me start where it actually began. Not in that office. In the kitchen of a house in Decatur, Georgia, 23 years ago, when everything I had built with my own two hands was about to be taken from me. I was 51 years old at the time, a licensed practical nurse for nearly 20 years, the kind of woman who showed up early and stayed late, who knew every patient by name and remembered which ones liked their blinds open in the morning. My husband Gerald had his own contracting business. We weren't rich, but we were solid. We had a 3-bedroom house on Waverly Drive with a magnolia tree in the front yard that bloomed every April like it was showing off. We had a daughter, Simone. She was 24, already engaged to a man named Clifton who worked in commercial real estate and wore his confidence like an expensive cologne, too much of it, always. I never trusted Clifton. I want to say that plainly, not because I was the kind of mother-in-law who couldn't let go of her daughter, but because there are people in this world who look at what you have and immediately start calculating what portion of it they can redirect toward themselves. Clifton was one of those people. He smiled when he shook your hand, and his eyes were always moving, always assessing. But Simone loved him, and I loved Simone, so I learned to set the table for him and ask about his projects and hold my tongue. The trouble started with my mother-in-law, Gerald's mother. A woman I will call Miss Ida, because even now I cannot bring myself to say her full name without feeling something cold move through me. Miss Ida had never liked me. I was too outspoken, she said, too independent. She had wanted Gerald to marry a woman from their church, a quiet woman who would fold herself around the family like a napkin. Instead, he married me, and for 31 years she made sure I knew she considered that a mistake. When Gerald's health started to decline, his heart had been giving him trouble since his early 50s. Miss Ida began spending more time at our house. Helping, she said. But I noticed things. Money I had set aside and our joint account moving in ways I hadn't authorized. Receipts I couldn't account for. Gerald, in his exhaustion, had given Miss Ida access to his accounts to help manage some of his business expenses. I didn't know the full extent of it until later. Much later. The morning 2 detectives showed up at my front door. I was getting ready for a 12-hour shift. I still had my scrubs on. One of them was holding a folder, and he looked at me with an expression I have thought about many times since. Not unkind, but certain. The way people look at you when the paperwork has already decided who you are. They said I had been skimming from a client's estate. I was a licensed practical nurse, not an estate manager. I had never had access to any client's finances, but Miss Ida had found a way. She had forged my signature on documents. She had used my nursing credentials and my name, and she had built a story around me the way you'd build a set on a stage, carefully, deliberately, with attention to what would look real from a distance. I froze. I said I was innocent. I said it standing in my own doorway in my scrubs at 6:15 in the morning, and I said it in the courthouse, and I said it to every person who would listen, and it made no difference at all. The lawyer Gerald hired cost us everything, and still I was convicted. Fraudulent misappropriation of funds from a vulnerable adult. I was sentenced to 4 years. I served 31 months. I will not spend a long time on those 31 months. Not because they weren't hard. They were the hardest thing I have ever survived, but because I made a decision early on that I was not going to let that place define me. I enrolled in every program they offered: business administration, financial literacy, a real estate pre-licensing course that one of the volunteers brought in on a donation. I read everything I could get my hands on. I wrote letters to Simone that she never answered. That part was what almost broke me. Not the cell. Not the food, not the fluorescent lights that never fully turned off. It was the silence from my daughter. Clifton had been whispering to her the whole time. I found out later. He told her that I had always been dishonest, that there were signs she had missed. He had taken Miss Ida's fabricated story and added his own embellishments and fed them to my daughter piece by piece until she believed I was a stranger she had mistaken for her mother. Gerald tried to stand by me at first, but his health was worsening, and he was tired, and Miss Ida was there every day, and eventually he too went quiet. He died 14 months after my conviction. I was not allowed to attend his funeral. I found out through a letter from a cousin. When I was released, I had $187 in a debit account, a duffel bag, and a felony conviction that followed me like a shadow. I could not go back to nursing. My license was suspended. The house on Waverly Drive had been sold. Gerald's estate had handled it, which meant Miss Ida had effectively handled it, and whatever was left after his debts had gone to Simone, who by then was married to Clifton and living in a new construction home in Alpharetta. I moved into a room in a boarding house in East Point. The woman who ran it was named Mrs. Fontaine, and she was 73 years old, and she had a cat named Biscuit, and she asked me one question when I showed up at her door. "Can you pay the first month?" I said yes, barely, and she handed me a key, and that was that. I want to tell you about Mrs. Fontaine because she matters. She never asked me what I'd done or whether I was guilty. She asked me once, about 3 weeks in, sitting at our kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee between us, whether I knew what I was going to do next. I told her I wanted to get into real estate. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "My nephew has a broker's license and too much to do. I'll give you his number." It was not instant. Nothing about rebuilding is instant. I want to be honest about that, because I think people hear a story like this and they imagine a clean arc, one door closing and another opening. What actually happened was 12 months of studying and failing my Georgia real estate salesperson exam twice, and passing it the 3rd time at 54 years old. 18 months of cold calls and rejection and working weekends and eating rice and canned beans and being laughed at, politely or not, by people who saw a woman my age with a record and a lapsed nursing license and no network to speak of. But I learned. Lord, I learned. I learned how to read a market. I learned how to talk to investors, how to find undervalued properties in neighborhoods people hadn't noticed yet, how to spot a deal before it became obvious to everyone else. Mrs. Fontaine's nephew, whose name was Alan, turned out to be decent and fair, and he gave me a split that wasn't generous but was honest, and I worked that arrangement for 3 years until I had enough to get my broker's license. By the time I was 60, I had my own small firm. 2 agents besides myself. We specialize in first-generation home buyers and overlooked properties in transitional neighborhoods. East Point, College Park, parts of Vine City. We weren't flashy. We were steady. And steady, I had come to understand, was worth more than flashy in the long run. I heard about Simone occasionally through distant family. She and Clifton had a son, a little boy whose name I did not know for the first 2 years of his life because no one told me he had been born. I found out at a 4th of July cookout when a cousin mentioned it in passing, the way you'd mention something everyone already knew. I had to excuse myself and sit in my car for 20 minutes. Miss Ida died the year I turned 62. I did not go to the funeral, not out of bitterness, or not only out of bitterness, but because I had made a decision that I would only show up in places where I had been genuinely invited. And her funeral was not one of those places. About a year after Miss Ida passed, something started to shift. My cousin Deborah, who had always kept a tentative foot in both sides, told me that Clifton and Simone were having trouble. I didn't take satisfaction in that. I want to be honest about that too. I had spent too many years working through my feelings about my daughter to take satisfaction in her struggle. What I felt was closer to a dull ache, a wish that things had been different. Deborah was also the one who told me 8 months later that Simone had filed for divorce, that Clifton had been unfaithful more than once over a long period of time, that Simone had found out through a series of small discoveries that must have felt, I imagined, like watching a floor you thought was solid slowly give way beneath you. I did not call her. I know some people would say I should have, but I had been calling for years, not literally, because she had blocked my number, but in every other way. I had written letters that went unanswered. I had left messages with cousins. I had sent a card on her birthday every single year without exception. If she wanted to find me, she knew where to look. I was 63 when she did. She came to my office. Not the first one, not the rented desk in Allen's brokerage. My actual office, the one with my name on the door and 2 agents working in the room outside. She stood in the doorway in a gray wool coat, and she looked exactly like the girl I had raised, and also like someone I didn't entirely recognize. And for a long moment, neither of us said anything. She said, "I know what Clifton did, and I know what Miss Ida did. I found the documents. I want to tell you I was gracious in that moment, that I said something warm and wise. The truth is, I cried. I cried in a way I hadn't since those first months in that boarding house room, when I would wake at 3 in the morning and lie there in the dark feeling the specific weight of being innocent and convicted and abandoned all at the same time. She had found papers in Clifton's home office during the divorce proceedings. He had kept things, because people like Clifton always keep things. Some instinct for self-protection that ends up being their undoing. Among them were communications between him and Miss Ida that made clear they had coordinated the accusation against me. Miss Ida had done the forgery. Clifton had helped coach the story, had connected Miss Ida with someone who could make the paperwork look credible. He had wanted me gone because I was the one person who saw through him, and with me gone, Gerald's illness had made the family easier to manage, and Simone's grief had made her easier to keep. Simone had taken those documents to an attorney before she came to see me. Then she came to see me. The civil case took 14 months. The criminal referral that came out of it took longer. Clifton eventually pleaded guilty to charges related to fraud and obstruction. He lost his real estate license. He lost the house in Alpharetta. The criminal exposure from Miss Ida's original actions, now proven to have been fabricated with his assistance, added additional counts. I am not going to pretend I felt nothing when I heard the verdict. I felt something. I will leave it at that. What I want to tell you about is the opening, because that is where the story has its ending, or rather its beginning, the beginning of whatever comes next. Simone had been taking art classes quietly for years, something she'd started during the marriage as a kind of private life that Clifton couldn't touch. She was good. Genuinely good, not the way family says someone is good, but the kind of good that makes strangers stop walking and stand in front of something for a moment longer than they planned. She had her first gallery opening in Ponce City Market, in one of those long, airy spaces with tall windows and exposed brick. She called me herself. She called me on a Thursday evening when I was reviewing a contract, and she said, "Mom, I want you to come. I want you there." I told her I would be there. What she did not know, because I hadn't told anyone, was that 3 weeks before her opening, my firm had closed the largest deal in our company's history. A portfolio acquisition in the West End that I had been working for 14 months. It was the kind of deal that changes the shape of things. I had also, just that month, been named one of Atlanta Business Chronicle's most influential women in real estate, a list that came with a profile and a photograph, and, as it turned out, recognition from people who had not previously known my name. I arrived at the gallery in a car that one of my investors had insisted on sending, a black Cadillac Escalade with a driver named Marcus who opened the door without being asked. I was wearing a navy dress and my mother's pearls, and I had done my hair the way I used to when I was younger, swept back, simple. I walked in alone. No announcement, no entrance. Just a woman in her mid-60s walking into an art gallery on a Friday evening. I heard the room change before I saw why. A murmur, a small collective shift in the tension. Someone said my name. Not my first name, my full name, the way it had appeared in the Business Chronicle profile. A woman I had never met reached out and touched my arm and said she had read my story and it had meant something to her. Simone saw me from across the room. She was standing with a group of people near one of her larger pieces, a painting in blues and grays that I later learned was called What My Mother Carried. She had painted it during the worst years, she told me after. when she still believed the story she'd been told. The irony of that her grief over losing me had produced something beautiful, is something I am still learning to sit with. She excused herself from the group and walked toward me. When she reached me, she took both my hands in hers and she said, quietly, "Do you know how many people here recognize you?" I said I didn't. She said, "More than recognize me. And this is my show." She was laughing a little when she said it, that specific laugh that I remembered from when she was a teenager, half embarrassed and half proud. I held on to both her hands and I looked at my daughter's face and I thought about the house on Waverly Drive and the magnolia tree and the detectives at the door and the boarding house and Alan's desk and every examination I had failed and passed and the 14 months of that civil case and all. The birthday cards that had gone unanswered. I didn't say any of that. I said, "Show me your work." And she did. She walked me through every piece in that gallery. She told me what each one had meant to her when she painted it, where she had been, what she had been feeling. Some of them were dark. Some of them were about the years she had lost, about believing things that weren't true, about what it costs to be deceived by the people closest to you. She talked about Clifton without flinching. She talked about Miss Ida with something more complicated than anger, a kind of sad clarity, the way you talk about someone who hurt you because they were also hurting and never found another way. At the end of the night, when most of the guests had gone and the catering staff was quietly stacking glasses, Simone and I sat down in 2 folding chairs near the back window with plastic cups of sparkling water. She asked me how I had done it, how I had kept going when there was nothing to go back to. I thought about Mrs. Fontaine. I thought about that kitchen table and those 2 cups of coffee and the question she had asked me, "What are you going to do next?" Not what happened to you. Not how are you coping. Just, what next? I told Simone that. I told her that grief is legitimate and anger is legitimate and there is no shortcut through either one. But at some point you have to decide what you are building because time passes either way. I had decided I was building something. I had held on to that decision on the days when it felt like a lie and eventually it stopped feeling like a lie. She nodded. She looked out the window at Pond City Market lit up at night, the Ferris wheel turning slowly against the dark sky. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know that's not enough. I know it doesn't cover it." I said, "No, but it's where we start." She squeezed my hand. "I am 66 years old now. My firm has 5 agents and we are expanding. Simone and I have dinner every other Sunday. She brings my grandson, who is 4 years old and has Gerald's eyes and a vocabulary that startles strangers. Mrs. Fontaine passed away 2 years ago and I was one of the people who spoke at her service. Alan sent flowers. There are people who ask me sometimes how I survived it, the injustice of it, the loneliness, the years of being seen as something I was not. And I tell them what I believe is true. I survived it the same way most people survive the unsurvivable. Not heroically, not with a plan, one morning at a time, one small decision. 1 cup of coffee across a kitchen table from someone who didn't ask what I had done, but asked instead what I was going to do. That question saved my life. And on the nights when I sit in my office on the 14th floor and watch the lights of Atlanta spread out below me, I try to remember the woman who answered it honestly. Alone in a boarding house room at 52 years old, with $187 at duffel bag and every reason in the world to give up. She didn't. And that is the only story worth telling. I think about Clifton sometimes. Not with anger anymore, just with a kind of quiet recognition. He was a man who believed that if he controlled the story, he controlled the outcome. And for a long time, he was right. He controlled what Simone believed about me. He controlled what the family whispered at gatherings I wasn't invited to. He took something as simple as a mother's love for her daughter and turned it into a weapon against us both. And then, eventually, the truth did what truth tends to do when given enough time. It found its way out through a file folder in a home office he thought was private. That is not luck. That is cause and effect. Plain and simple. Clifton made choices, and those choices left a trail, and the trail was found. Miss Ida made choices too, and though she died before any accounting came, what she set in motion didn't disappear with her. It came back around. It always does. I don't say that to be righteous. I say it because I spent years confused about why doing the right thing wasn't protecting me. I was honest. I worked hard. I loved my daughter without condition, and I still ended up in a cell. What I had to learn, slowly, painfully, in a boarding house room with thin walls and a cat named Biscuit somewhere down the hall, was that doing the right thing is not a transaction. You don't do it because it guarantees a good outcome. You do it because it's the only way to live with yourself when everything else is stripped away. That understanding, I think, was the first thing that saved me. Not faith in the system, not hope that someone would rescue me. Just a decision about what kind of woman I was going to be when no one was watching and nothing was going my way. The second thing that saved me was using my mind when I had every reason to shut down. I could have spent those 31 months in survival mode, just enduring. Instead, I studied. I read every real estate course packet that volunteer brought in. I learned things I had no immediate use for and stored them anyway, because I understood somewhere deep in my gut that knowledge is the one thing no one can confiscate from you. When I walked out of that facility, I walked out with more education than I had walked in with. That didn't feel like a silver lining. It felt like the only rational response to an irrational situation. And then there was the third thing, which is the one people ask about most: the persistence. The continuing to show up after the exam failed twice, after the cold calls went nowhere, after another door closed in a way that felt personal even when it wasn't. I will not romanticize that. There were mornings when I sat on the edge of my bed in East Point and genuinely could not identify a reason to stand up. What got me up was not inspiration. It was something smaller and more stubborn than that. The refusal to let the ending be written by someone else. Simone asked me at the gallery how I kept going. I gave her the Mrs. Fontaine answer, and that was true. But the longer answer is this: I kept going because I had decided that my life belonged to me, even when it didn't look like it. Even when I had $187 and a felony conviction and a daughter who thought I was dead to her. I was still the one who got to decide what I built next. That decision, made in private, with no audience, no guarantee of reward, turned out to be everything.